1 Kings 20 and 21. We return to the history of the southern kingdom. They will continue about 130 years past the fall of the northern kingdom. We recall that all 19 kings of the north were idolatrous, worshiping other deities. When it comes to the kings of the south, we're told that between 5 and 7 of the 19 are good. And usually the text will clarify what we mean by good, and that is that they followed in the footsteps of David, their father, in worshiping Yahweh. The reason we say between 5 and 7 is because a couple of them will turn from Yahweh. And even as we have just seen the life of Hezekiah, we are nervous at the end of his life how loyal he was. And then we're going to be shocked in our reading, in fact we saw this today, how his son Manasseh immediately turns to the worship of other gods. It has caused the question, and it came up in our monthly call, why the switch between these good kings and bad kings, and then good kings again? Why that switch back and forth in the southern kingdom? In fact, after Jehoshaphat, we have Jehoram, who just makes this sudden turn. After Hezekiah, again, Manasseh makes this sudden and abrupt turn toward the worship of other gods. Well, why is that? And we had some interesting conversation on the call, but let me use this time to think through some of those options with us. First, we have the influence of other nations. Remember that going on around Israel at this time is the worship of other deities, and so the general temptation of any king in going into league with another nation, or at least avoiding war, would be to worship the gods of those other nations. So I think it's good to remember that. Secondly, from what we know, the population, the average villager, even in the southern monarchy, is going to be surprisingly polytheistic. This is where archaeology has given us indication that in the villages of Israel and Judah, the idea that Yahweh was the sovereign creator of all things seems to be rather rare. And again, the temptation would have been to think that Yahweh was just another local village deity within the populace. Thirdly, the priests seem to be evil throughout Israel's and Judah's history. There are some good ones, but notice again the mention of a good priest, like Jehoiada to King Joash in that story. When Jehoiada dies at age 130, Joash's kingdom goes downhill. So just the very mention of a good priest seems to be the indication that in general the priests were evil and allowing this other god worship on every high hill. This is all to say then that we should always presume, and I hate to say it this way, but I think that's the tendency of the story, is that we should presume that the king would be evil, and that the good kings that we have in the southern monarchy are the exception to the rule. And again, it's not happy news, but the strong temptation of these kings to follow in the ways of the priests and the people and the other nations, I think, should be kind of our natural tendency to suspect that was going to happen. The last thing I want to mention gets into the New Testament, but here's where we need to start, coalescing the larger story of Scripture. When we get to Paul in the New Testament, he is going to have a vast vast vocabulary of explaining what he seems to understand as not a hierarchy and not even a pantheon, but a host of evil, powerful spirits that are working not just against the average Christian of his day, speaking of Paul again, but especially against the rulers of the human race. So the Roman Empire, for example, would be a place where these spiritual rulers seem to have a lot of play and a lot of power. When it comes to the terms that Paul uses, this is just Paul, words like, and it depends upon your translation, of course, your English translation, but powers, holy ones, rulers, authorities, dominions, and thrones are his most common terms. In fact, rulers and authorities, he will pair those together 8 times, especially in the books of Ephesians and Colossians, as he looks up into the heavens and says, what we have up there are powers that are working against us as Christians, and especially against rulers of this age. So listen to Ephesians 1:21. where he mentions not just these two, but he uses other terms as well. Jesus is now seated, again thinking of Paul's timing, he's after the ascension of Jesus. Jesus is now seated far above all principality, that's the word there for rulers, and powers, that's the word for authorities, and might, that's the word for powers there, and dominion there. Kuriates, using the word kurios, or lords. And every name that is named not only in this age but also in that which is to come. Jesus is now, in Paul's chronology, sitting above these beings in the heavens. Colossians 1:16, for by Jesus all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, and then he describes what those are, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, again using those two terms. All things were created through him and for him. The point being that after Jesus' ascension, as the story moves through the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, what we have in Paul's understanding is Jesus being over these beings, and thus, now think backwards, the fact that Jesus will become over these beings implies that these beings are active, doing their thing, as it were, back in the story. Now that brings us back to the Old Testament then, that I would recommend that what we have in these gods here that are created powers of the Old Testament that the kings of the north worshipped en masse, and many of the kings of the south worshipped, they are these same beings that Paul now will be able to say, using Greek language, not Hebrew. It is over these beings that Jesus now rules. So that's how the story will one day, especially in our New Testament reading, will connect.